We have been dominated ever since the end of the Second World War by a very Western, Americanized set of values, often to the detriment of Asian values where they are in conflict. And I think we're beginning to see a seismic change in the center of gravity of the world. And I believe far-sighted Bhutan's leadership sees that as Asia develops, Bhutan's position as a land-connected country between South Asia and Southeast Asia is not a disadvantage. It's a wonderful, profound advantage. And Geopolitical Mindfulness City is an effort to take advantage of that.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I have the very great privilege of talking about a small but fascinating nation with a man who has been observing its developments in and outside for over 50 years. I've got with me Mr. Michael Rutland to discuss Bhutan. Michael studied physics and mathematics at London University before moving to Bhutan, where he assisted in setting up a school and taught the future Fourth King of Bhutan. Michael has now made over 160 educational television programs in Bhutan and is the founder of the Bhutan Society of the United Kingdom. He was awarded an Order of the British Empire in 2005 by Queen Elizabeth II for services with British-Bhutanese relations, and he is also the holder of Bhutan's Order of Merit. Oh, and he became a Bhutanese citizen as well. He's currently living in Thimphu, the capital. Michael, welcome.
Yes, I hardly recognize myself from all that description.
Well, I mean, the description that one finds about you is absolutely beautiful, because I think you originally hadn't planned to spend your life in Bhutan, had you?
I had no wish, no aim, nor any thought of spending even 1 minute in the Kingdom of Bhutan.
And because now it has been 50 years.
Now it's been 53 years since I first came here, and that was almost by accident as well.
What was the accident about, and how did it happen that then you went to Bhutan in the early 70s?
I was teaching physics at a very upmarket boys' boarding school in Oxford, and I made the great mistake of going out to a dinner party in Oxford. Now, you should always be very careful about going to dinner parties in Oxford, because it can lead to all sorts of unexpected consequences. And I met a lady there called Deki Leidenla from a very distinguished family in Sikkim. And a few weeks later, she wrote to me to ask if I was interested in teaching science in the Kingdom of Bhutan for a year or so. And I immediately wrote back and said, no, thank you. Because first of all, Oxford was a very nice place to live. Secondly, I had absolutely no idea where Bhutan was. And if I heard the word Bhutan, I would immediately think of butane gas and of Afghanistan and Azerbaijan and all the ANs. And I had no particular wish to go there. So I wrote back and said, no, thank you. She then wrote to me again 3 weeks later, repeating the invitation. And I had no idea where Bhutan was. On the Monday morning, I telephoned the Royal Geographical Society and said to the lady who answered the phone, I wonder if you can tell me anything about somewhere called Bhutan. And there was a bit of a silence. And then she said in a very aggressive voice, why do you want to know? I thought, oh dear me, Monday morning, perhaps she'd had a good weekend. And I explained that I'd been invited to go and work there for a year. And there was another very long silence. And she said, well, you must come and see us. When can you come and see us? So I went on the Wednesday afternoon. I went up to London and went to RGS. And to my surprise, I was shown up to the director's office. And the director explained to me that Bhutan was one of the least known countries in the world. Nobody came out, nobody went in, nobody knew anything about it. And as he was telling me all this, I became even more convinced that Oxford was much more fun. And then the lady with the acerbic voice appeared. She was in charge of the map room. And she said, would you like to see our map of Bhutan? And I said, well, yes. We went down to the map room. She opened up the leather folder, showed me the Royal Geographical Society's map of Bhutan, which was a piece of paper about A3 size with the lozenge shape of Bhutan on it. And the microsecond at which I decided, yes, I'll go, was when I looked at this and across the map was written the word unmapped. And so I decided I would come to Bhutan for a year and teach science. I wasn't really clear who I was going to teach science to. That became clear to my surprise a little later. So I came here in 1971, little realizing how this unintended, unaimed for change of scenery just for a year would change my whole life.
I
compare Bhutan to a beautiful spider which weaves a silken web around some people from which they never manage to escape. So now at the age of 87, 53 years later, here I am sitting talking to you in Bhutan.
You know, the story itself is absolutely fantastic, but it's so closely linked to what I would like to know more from you about, which is the political setup of this country. And how is it that in 1971, when that is way after the Second World War, that is way after the great wave of colonialism of the 18th and 19th centuries. How come that toward the end of the 20th century, in the second half, a place like the United Kingdom had no adequate maps of the whole country? How come that it was still this last plot of land that was basically unknown to the Europeans?
No chancellery in the world had a better knowledge of Bhutan than London's Foreign Office. During the days of the British Raj, there were a number of official visits by colonial administrators from India to Bhutan, and they wrote reports. And some of them are quite entertaining, couched in old Victorian language. One particular visitor who didn't have a particularly good time here, he wrote, and if I can remember, his words were, "The habits of all people are exceeding filthy, and it would be a brave man who would willingly interpose one of these natives between the wind and his nobility." And so the United Kingdom, London, the Foreign Office, had much better knowledge of Bhutan than any other nation in the world. But then after 1947 and India's independence, the Foreign Office more or less lost interest in Bhutan. They felt that it was under India's sphere of influence and far too unimportant for the United Kingdom to bother about anymore. During the days of the Raj, the interest of the United Kingdom was not so much in taking over Bhutan, but they saw Bhutan as a trade route through to Lhasa and Tibet. So no real efforts were made to occupy and take over Bhutan. It was considered far too unimportant a place, fortunately. But the greatest challenge of the leaders of Bhutan for the 200 and odd years of the British Raj was to keep the British out. And it is their success in doing that, which means that today Bhutan remains a sovereign country. Had the British made Bhutan a part of the British Empire, the Indian Empire, then probably we would be a state of the Union of India. And the skill of the Bhutanese leadership, the political skill, and shrewdness, cleverness, is really to be admired. And one very simple little element. The first king of Bhutan, when the British wrote to him from India, they would address him as His Highness the Maharaja of Bhutan. And he replied with his subscript was His Highness the Maharaja of Bhutan. The second king, the British would write to him as His Highness the Maharaja of Bhutan, but he would always reply over a signature block which said, His Majesty the Druk Gyalpo. And still the British would refer to him as the Maharaja of Bhutan. But when Mountbatten came as Governor General of, well, Viceroy of India, and was looking to persuade all the Maharajas to join the club of Maharajas and give up their land to the Indian state, he realized that the Druk Gyalpo, His Majesty the Druk Gyalpo, was not an ordinary Maharaja, because Mountbatten, with his semi-royal connections, had a great nose for royal titles. And so he never put any pressure on the second king of Bhutan to join the club of Maharajas. And that is one small reason, not the only reason, that is one small reason why Bhutan was not incorporated into the Indian, the state, the Union of India. And Americans sometimes come here and they say, oh, Michael, why are you all so fussed about these titles? His Majesty, Her Majesty, Your Royal Highness. And I try to explain to them that, first of all, of course, America has no history, which they don't like. And secondly, titles matter. And in politics and diplomacy, titles can be very, very important. And Bhutan's continuation as a sovereign country is perhaps an example of the importance of titles.
It's funny that they would ask you that. You should just ask the back, how would you feel if I addressed your president as a prime minister? You would immediately correct me,
exactly.
Right?
But then, yes, I'm not going to make any more comments about Americans.
That's a good thing, because I really want to talk about Bhutan. And when I count the countries in Asia that were uncolonized, I usually go with Japan, that then itself became a colonizer, and Thailand, which is the only one that was neither colonized nor became one. But everybody, or me, I always forget about Bhutan, never colonized and self-ruled. Right. There was a relationship with the British Crown during the time when it colonized India, but the political setup,
not in Bhutan. The second king attended the Durbar in Delhi, but he didn't attend as a subservient Maharaja in the way that all the other Maharajas did. And apart from that, there was no relationship with the British Crown at all in those days. The relationship might have been with some colonial servants in Delhi who would come to visit. But there was no relationship really and truly with the British Crown.
So what did that lead to? I mean, in terms of the political setup, today Bhutan, as far as I understand, is a constitutional monarchy where the monarch still has considerable power, but not as it used to be. Could you tell me a little bit about how it was set up when you arrived, like internally, politically?
Well, in order to do that, I'm afraid I need to talk about the history of Bhutan.
Please.
Can I do that?
Yes.
Now, the history of Bhutan, written by Dr. Karma Phuntsho, is absolutely excellent and authoritative. However, it is that thick. I will give you the whole history of Bhutan in 5 sentences, if I may. If we go back, the first event was the arrival of Guru Rinpoche, otherwise known as Padmasambhava, in approximately 800, bringing with him Buddhism. Nothing of great significance happened for another 800 years until in 16 something or another, I'm not a historian, approximate dates, until 1600s, the arrival of the Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyal from Tibet. And it was the Shabdrung who in effect created the concept of a nation of Bhutan. He built all the dzongs and he managed to get control of the whole country. Nothing happened for another few hundred years. So we have the Shabdrung in 16 something or another. Nothing happened until 1907, the coming of the hereditary monarchy. After 1947, nothing happened until 1971, which was Bhutan joining the United Nations. Nothing then happened until 16, 17 years ago, the coming of constitutional monarchy and parliamentary democracy. So those are the 5 stars in the history of Bhutan. Everything that happened in between those were of no enormous significance as far as the place of Bhutan in the world is concerned. So, why did the monarchy come about in 1907? And the answer is that the Shabdrung unified the country, but after he died, it was felt by high officials that if his death was known, Bhutan would descend into internecine fighting. And so his death was kept secret for 47 years. It was put around that he was in deep meditation. And it is still true, rather like King Arthur in England, who is in Tintagel Castle, it is still believed that the first Shabdrung is in deep meditation in Punakha Dzong. However, when his death became known, what followed was 200 years of continual internal warfare, one warlord fighting another. And the life of the people was terrible. The first king's father, Jigme Namgyal, he became the most powerful and successful warlord. And he managed to hand to his son, the first king of Bhutan, Ugyen Wangchuck, a situation where almost the infighting had been stopped. And the internal warfare was brought to an end by Ugyen Wangchuck, a very shrewd, powerful, clever man, both philosophically, politically, and militarily. And in 1907, all the high officials and monks got together and elected Ugyen Wangchuck as the first hereditary king of Bhutan. I'm sometimes asked why the monarchy here is so popular when others around have gone. And I have the answer in 4 sentences. Number 1, the coming of the monarchy brought internal peace to a country which for 200 years had been riven by internal fighting. Number 2, the kings of Bhutan, all of them, have remained very, very close to the people. I exemplify it if you've been to Kathmandu and looked at the royal palace and looked at the height of the iron railings around the royal palace. The railings are probably 30 feet high. The little wall around the royal palace in Bhutan comes up to my hip. And that exemplifies the way in which the monarchs of Bhutan, all of them, have remained very close to the people. In fact, in the constitution, every Bhutanese citizen has the right of personal audience with the king. And there is a structure and system for implementing that. Reason number 3, all the kings of Bhutan have lived very simply. You don't get solid gold taps in the little palace. The 4th king still goes around either in a Hilux or a rather old, battered Toyota Land Cruiser. The 5th king has 1 or 2 slightly better cars, but he's never bought them. They've been gifted to him. The lifestyle of the monarchy compared with others, and I worked for 5 years for the Sultan of Oman, the late Sultan of Oman, where there were solid gold taps. The lifestyle of the kings have been very simple compared with other monarchies. And the 4th reason is that it has been patently obvious that every one of the 5 kings of Bhutan have been absolutely dedicated to the nation and the people and not to their own financial and material aggrandizement. And those are the 4 reasons why I believe the monarchy of Bhutan is so well loved. And a few years ago, I met a journalist for a big English newspaper who was writing an article on Bhutan. And I had dinner with him the day he arrived. And at dinner, he said to me, I have to be perfectly honest, I'm a total Republican. I think all these monarchies are nonsense. I've been to so many countries where I see pictures of kings all over the wall, and it's all a load of rubbish. And I thought, oh dear. Anyway, I met him at the end of a 3-week stay here. And he said, very impressive. I'll send you a copy of my article before it's published. Duly, a couple of weeks later, it arrived. The penultimate paragraph said, this is a terrible thing for a committed Republican to say, but after 3 weeks in the Kingdom of Bhutan, I have come to the conclusion that the King of Bhutan is doing rather a good job. English understatement. Next paragraph. I believe he is the only world leader who understands that a farmer working on his own small farm in a stable village community with an income of $50 a year is a great deal happier than the same man working in a Nike football factory for $5,000 a year. And that was the view, indeed, of the 4th king, which inspired him to make this comment, which has become world famous now, about gross national happiness. Fundamentally, the 4th king, at a very young age, when he talked about gross national happiness, he was early 20s. What he was trying to say, he was more interested in how content his people were than in how many dollars they had in their back pocket. So we have the hereditary monarchy. But just as in his early 20s, the fourth king was convinced that contentment was more important than dollars, he also was firmly committed to follow his father, the third king's initiative in bringing power away from an absolute monarch towards the people. And all those years ago, decades before democracy came, the fourth king was determined to bring in constitutional monarchy and democracy. And he did it 17 years ago. So it wasn't a sudden decision. It wasn't a decision under pressure from America or the United Nations. Certainly, it wasn't a decision under pressure from the people, because you will know as well as me that at the time, if you had taken a public opinion poll, 99.99% of the population would have voted to keep rule by the king. It was an absolute belief and commitment from the day he became king. Because as you'll know, his father, the third king, started off as an absolute monarch. But he was the man who created the National Assembly and the Royal Advisory Council to try very slowly to move towards the people having a say in the government of the country. So we now have a constitutional monarchy and a multi-party democracy. And it was not a sudden decision under pressure from anybody. It was a sincere belief of the third and the fourth king. And now the difficult job of implementing it all has been left to the fifth king. And sometimes people ask me, why did the fourth king retire when he was only in his 50s? And my answer is this. All over Bhutan, you will see pictures of the fourth king. People grew up for 100 years with the view that the king was the fount of all beneficence. Any problem, the king would solve it. Any need, the king would satisfy it. Anything at all, the king. The king was the total power. I believe the fourth king realized that after constitutional monarchy and democracy, people would find it very difficult to look at that same person and understand that now it was a constitutional monarchy, that his power had been handed over to the people. So my buzzword is saying new constitutional monarchy, new democracy, new young face.
That makes perfect sense for guiding also the views of the population, and also like this change in the way that self-government functions. I keep saying we're a planet of 8 billion people condemned to self-organizing, and it seems to me Bhutan has its very own way of self-organizing. How is that now going after 17 years of constitutional monarchy with parliamentary democracy? How's the stability, the political stability of the country? And maybe if I'm informed correctly, Bhutan is slightly smaller than my native Switzerland. It's about 38,000 square kilometers, and it's about 700,000 people, right? It's not as small as like some other nations like the Maldives, but it is a very small one, especially within its neighborhood. You only have two neighbors, right? You only have China to the north and India to the south, right?
Absolutely. The ham in the sandwich.
How is it internally, the stability at the moment, and how's the relationship with these two large neighbors?
Well, the latter is a very big question. The former, one of the wonderful things about living in Bhutan and looking at the instability in the United States the instability in England, the instability in Germany, the instability in Italy, the instability in the Middle East, the instability in parts of Africa. Bhutan is a gem, a jewel, a diamond of stability. And even with our multi-party democracy, one little problem with multi-party democracy is that it requires division. Otherwise, there's no point in having different political parties. So I think one downside is that the emergence of political parties has created divisions that did not really exist before. But, and this is so important, the unifying factor, which, as it were, cements over the divisions, is the monarchy. And the king is seen as still the unifying father figure. And that is because of the four reasons that I gave you a little earlier. So Bhutan is politically very stable. We have just had an election where the party which formed the second government lost the third election, has now won the fourth election. Because each political party has almost exactly the same manifesto, one other little danger is that voting has become more based on personalities than on policies. But if we look at other countries in the world, sometimes there are no policies. Sometimes it's all on personalities. I need hardly refer to some big countries where the voting is on personalities. So Bhutan is no different, but it is less extreme than in many of the countries we see in the world today, where democracy is not terribly successful, where voting is based often on extremism, ignorance, etc. I can't resist quoting Winston Churchill's famous statement about democracy, when he said, the biggest argument against democracy is a 10-minute conversation with the average voter. Well, that is absolutely true in England, as in America. I'm not sure about Switzerland, because nobody in the world understands the political system in Switzerland.
We do something similar to Bhutan, which is we value stability over this division. We do it by actually not voting for people; we vote for issues, right?
Right.
And that also creates stability.
It's the exact opposite of Bhutan at the moment.
Yeah, it is the exact opposite of a monarchical system, but it is something that creates stability over the long term.
No, you mentioned a monarchical system. The point is, the difference, voting for policies versus voting for people, is nothing to do with monarchy. It's to do with multi-party democracy.
Right.
People don't vote for the king.
Right. That's true. So the king stays, and the king is the integrating factor in Switzerland. The integrating factor is the fact that we can vote for issues, so we don't need to care that much about the parties because we know we can override them. And in a sense, the trust in Bhutan is that the king would look after in the end, still for the good of the people, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. You don't really have anybody in Switzerland who is the equivalent of the king.
No, the opposite. We don't even have an equivalent of a prime minister because it's 7 ministers who share power, and none of them is more powerful than the other, and then they have to do that. But
if you had a more conflicting situation, you would all be excellent at shooting apples off people's heads.
Exactly. That's what the Germans told us, what we are good about with the wonderful place.
Yes,
But let me get back to Bhutan because like the foreign policy issue is really something that's burning under my
right.
fingernails because you do have some border disputes with China, as far as I understand, and there is this example of Tibet, right, which in many ways was a very important neighbor until it became part of China today.
Right.
So
If
how
you
is the relationship with China developing at the moment?
well, let me go back again to the mid 60s. Until the mid 60s, Bhutan's relationships had always been north, not south. In fact, the threat to Bhutan came not from the north, but from the British in India. The annexation, or whatever word, different people have different words, of Tibet by China in the 60s, for the first time alerted Bhutan to a danger from the north. As you know, Mao Zedong once made a speech in which he referred to Aksai Ching, Kashmir, Nepal, Sikkim, and Bhutan as the 5 fingers of his Tibetan hand. That was never acted on, and it was actually never repeated. Nevertheless, the third king of Bhutan realized the potential danger from the north, and he made the conscious decision to align Bhutan with India in the south. And the third king was a very, very good politician in the nicest sense of the word. And he was able to persuade Nehru, but more importantly, his daughter, Indira Gandhi, to support Bhutan's application to join the United Nations. When I came here in 1971, there was no Indian ambassador. The Indian representative here held the title the Special Officer of India in Bhutan, because fundamentally, South Bloc in India did not really acknowledge Bhutan as a sovereign country. The success of the third king in persuading Indira Gandhi to support Bhutan's entry to the UN in 1971 was probably the most significant moment in Bhutan's whole history, because once it joined the UN, it was now a recognized sovereign country. And I think I was the only foreigner present, not counting Indians, the only Western foreigner present at the 3-day archery match in Thimphu to celebrate joining the United Nations. And a few days later, my friend, who was the Special Officer of India in Bhutan, was suddenly retitled His Excellency, the Ambassador of India to Bhutan. So that was a most significant moment, and that's why we are a sovereign nation today. So the relationship with India was developed by the third king in response to China's annexation of Tibet. It was developed and strengthened through India's support for Bhutan to join the United Nations. Bhutan's role as a sovereign country determined the nature of its relations with India. And even though the original treaty signed between India and Bhutan contained the clause that said Bhutan agrees to be advised by the government of India in the conduct of its foreign affairs, which was always interpreted as meaning it was part of India by the outside world, that was actually inherited from the British. Well, the success of the fourth king, and this was a manifestation of the trust between India and Bhutan even today, the fourth king was able 17 years ago to have renegotiated that treaty So that ambiguous statement about guided by the advice of India in the conduct of its foreign affairs was removed. And now the treaty with India does not contain that clause. That only happened because there was a genuine bond of trust between India and Bhutan. You will be aware that the Chogyal of Sikkim endeavored to follow Bhutan in joining the United Nations. And that was the button which was pressed to cause Indira Gandhi to act to annex Sikkim and make it a state of the Union of India. So we have to give great credit to the cleverness. I say shrewdness, but here in Bhutan, the word shrewdness is sometimes misunderstood. They've heard of the Shakespeare play, The Taming of the Shrew, and they think shrewdness is a nasty comment. Shrewdness, it means clever, intelligent, subtle, diplomatic, etc. So I give enormous credit to the third king for the way in which he developed this change of relationship from the north to the south with great success. And of course, we now owe a great deal to India for all the support it's given Bhutan. And some people say to me, oh, India gives a vast amount of aid to Bhutan. I do not call it aid in the conventional meaning of the word. I see it as, in fact, a commercial transaction. India is buying something from Bhutan, and is buying something which is priceless, which cannot be measured simply in money. India is buying from Bhutan security. Given the relationship between India and China, Bhutan's position is crucial to India's security. And so Bhutan doesn't sell gold and God knows what and motor cars. Bhutan sells its geopolitical position. And India benefits from that. And India acknowledges it.
That's my next question. Like what happened in the 1960s, and that India helped Bhutan to actually be then become a member of the UN instead of annexing it, or
not the 1960s. No, not the
70s.
It was in 1971.
Yes, but I suppose that took a little bit of time, right?
It took a few years before that.
And what you're saying right now, that Bhutan delivers security to India. I mean, is Bhutan taking the role of, in international relations parlance, is it a buffer state? Is it making sure that India has a secure border with China in that plot of land? I talked to Mongolian colleagues just recently, and they affirm pretty outrightly, look, Mongolia is a buffer between China and Russia. Is Bhutan a buffer between India and China?
By simple geographical location, it is clearly a buffer. It is between India and China. So yes, it is a buffer state. But given the threat that appeared in the 60s when China took over Tibet, the rights and wrongs of that are a big issue. There is some argument which says Tibet was rightfully part of China, but I'm very reluctant to say that because, of course, that is not the received view. Given the threat that appeared, it is very reasonable that Bhutan looks for security to the south and offers security to the south. It's a quid pro quo. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement.
And how does it do that? It's so much smaller than China. And how does Bhutan make sure that it has a good relationship with China, or good enough not to escalate border disputes?
That's a very, you'll be aware that the border with China has been discussed for, I think it is now 23 years. This was very interesting. 23 years ago, when Bhutan wanted to start border talks with China, India wanted to conduct them on behalf of Bhutan on the grounds that borders were part of international affairs. Bhutan, the fourth king, very wisely insisted that Bhutan would conduct its own border talks. And this was a manifestation, an overt manifestation of Bhutan's sovereignty. The talks have been going on for 23 years. Do you know any other border talks in the world that have gone on for 23 years? Doesn't the fact that they've gone on for so long in quite a friendly and peaceful manner say something?
It does. It does. But I must say, though, that China and India also have like border disputes, and they manage them, even though not as peacefully, way not as peacefully as Bhutan, but it's not going to all-out war. And we have maritime disputes, right, over islands, which at the moment, at least, are still managed, even though Bhutan is definitely the most peaceful of
Yes.
those.
So there we are. Shall we say any border issues between Bhutan and China are being managed? Sometimes management means doing nothing. Sometimes the best management strategy is calm.
Wait it out.
That's absolutely right. Absolutely right. And I think that is Bhutan's. I am not in any way speaking for the Foreign Ministry of Bhutan. This would just be a very personal perception. I believe Bhutan is just peacefully and quietly waiting it out and see what happens.
Which makes a lot of sense. And I would just, border disputes.
Professor, let me ask you what the alternatives is. The alternative would be that Bhutan moves its 7,000 strong army up to the northern border to face the People's Liberation Army of how many million?
Yes.
The other alternative would be that Bhutan invites the Indian army into the northern borders of Bhutan. Once they're there, they'll never leave as an independent country. Would you do that?
Never. Never.
Indeed. Therefore, the most intelligent, sensible, diplomatic strategy is just keep calm. Let's see how it goes. And maintain friendly relations.
That's something I would like to emphasize, because border disputes and disputes about land are to me something very toxic in international relations, because it's either yours or mine. At least it looks like this. But often enough, especially in Asia, we see that different states manage overlapping claims, and they do not go to war, and that's something to learn from. But it takes two to tango, right? It means the Chinese are playing along, actually, and you have some form of mutual understanding. So how is the trade relationship with China? Is trade working?
Trade?
Yes,
there is very little official trade. There is some. If you go to a furniture shop in Thimphu, you may find they hired a shipping container and bought some furniture in China and bought it. There's no massive trade.
And the rest of the relationship with China, is there any kind of anything happening between the two nations?
The last few years, the Chinese have sent over a state circus to give a few performances in Thimphu. Doesn't that remind you of the game of ping pong?
Uh,
You will recall in the days of Nixon, ping pong
diplomacy.
Yeah.
But it's
so
are Bhutanese afraid of China, or is China something that you look at with?
I don't think the Bhutanese are at all afraid of China. I think the way of dealing with some of these problems in the West is to get all worked up about it and send rockets.
Which is absolutely wrong.
Absolutely wrong. I think the Bhutanese way of saying, right, okay, there are differences, let's chat, let's see how it goes. A more laid back attitude. One of the lovely things about living in Bhutan, I have learned, don't get worked up about things so much. It'll all be all right in the end. In the West, in England, you get worked up about planning months ahead, everything, it's all tension. We get so worked up. Here, things are much more laid back. Let's see how it goes. It'll all turn out okay. Let's don't get too worked up. Especially if there's not much you can do about it.
Yes. I mean, I can only affirm that. I mean, then you better see what's going to come out of things anyhow. But
right.
At the same time, Bhutan, this is why I find it quite fascinating. It's small states have issues to confront that large states don't even really think about. And one of them, of course, is to be recognized by others, as you just explained, right? The recognition of titles and the recognition as a sovereign state is crucial. And now, what is for 2025? We are speaking on December 27th, right? We are about to enter the new year, at least in the Western calendar. What is on the foreign policy agenda of Bhutan that is currently really dear to the current king and the government?
Well, I think, first of all, the most important factor in foreign policy as of today will be to maintain the very close, friendly relationship with India. I think that is absolutely crucial. It may be that over the next 5-10 years, one sees some sort of relationship with China developing, but that is not a priority at the moment. What I think one will see, and this is manifested in the Gelefug Mindfulness City that you may have read about, the project for a big new city on the southeastern lowlands of Bhutan, just near the Indian border. What I think one will see is Bhutan trying to benefit from its geographical position. And the current Prime Minister, Sering Tobgay, made what I feel was a very perceptive comment a few months ago in a speech, when he said we should not think of ourselves as a landlocked country. We should think of ourselves as a land-connected country. And I think that was so right, because people say, oh, landlocked, how terrible, how difficult. But if you think it was land-connected, then you think, wonderful. So I think we shall see Bhutan trying to position itself as a link between the enormously growing economies of Southeast Asia and South Asia. And I, for one, believe the next few decades are going to be the decades of Asia and not the West. So I believe Bhutan will try and position itself as this land link between Southeast Asia and South Asia. Just look at the size of the populations in South and Southeast Asia combined. It is billions and billions.
Yeah.
And it is growing in power, wealth, position in the world. I'm a great believer in the cyclical nature of empires. All empires die. And I think we are beginning to see now the demise of the Western empires, whether they be political empires or financial empires, and the rise of Asia. And that will bring with it other things too. We have been dominated ever since the end of the Second World War by a very Western, Americanized set of values, often to the detriment of Asian values where they are in conflict. And Lee Kuan Yew, when he was in power towards the end of his time, he gave an excellent talk on the dangers of becoming too Western. And I think that has perhaps happened, not only in Bhutan, but in other places. And I think we're beginning to see a seismic change in the center of gravity of the world. And I believe far-sighted Bhutan's leadership sees that as Asia develops, Bhutan's position as a land-connected country between South Asia and Southeast Asia is not a disadvantage. It's a wonderful, profound advantage. And Geopolitical Michael in the city is an effort to take advantage of that.
So may I conclude from this discussion that while Bhutan used to be secluded and used to be an unknown quantity, today's Bhutan is integrated, wants to be integrated, and wants to be part of the Asian century. Is that fair to say?
Well, Professor, with great respect, this is why me, sitting in my house in Thimphu, is talking to you, a Swiss professor in Japan.
There we go. The world has already changed. So
that's right.
I'm happy about that. It's about time, and I hope that the example of peaceful Bhutan is going to stand like a lighthouse to show how disputes can be solved differently.
Right. So I would say the biggest challenge for Bhutan in the next 2 to 3 decades is to emerge more significantly into the outside world, whilst at the same time preserving and strengthening all those unique, wonderful elements of its own culture and sets of values which have seen it through from 800 to today.
Wonderful words, Bhutan. Stay yourself, but be part of all of us. So,
because the world has as much to learn from Bhutan as Bhutan has to learn from the world.
Wonderful words, Michael Rutland. Thank you very much for your time today.
Pleasure talking to you. Cheerio.